to the second day of GopherCon EU. I want to start off by saying a big thank you to our MCs and our organizers. So can you all join me in giving a round of applause to Matt, Natalie, Ale, and Donna, and everyone that made this conference possible. And thank you all so much for being here with me this morning. If I haven't met you yet, hi, my name is Julie. I work on the Go team at Google. And it's so great to be back here and to be at GopherCon EU all of this week. So I was last here at GopherCon EU back in 2019 when I was over in Tenerife, and I gave a talk on finding dependable Go packages and how the Go package discovery site can help you. So this is me power posing right before the talk. And I am so thrilled to be back here again 4 years later and meeting everyone and seeing some old friends and meeting all the new Gophers that are now part of our community. I currently lead the Go security team, which is a team that is working on helping keep the Go ecosystem secure and reliable. And we are also specifically working on helping Go developers find vulnerabilities in their dependencies, which is what I'm here to talk to all of you about today. And when I mention vulnerabilities, the first thing you might be wondering is, what does it even really mean to be vulnerable? Well, if we look at the definition of a vulnerability, here's what Google search will tell us. It's the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. And there's even a little box here that tells us how important vulnerability is. Vulnerability, it tells us, can give us a sense of belonging. It's essential to the human experience. And of course, this is referring to our interpersonal relationships. And I'm no Brene Brown, so I'll let you watch her talk later. But the idea and definition of a vulnerability for software, though, is actually not really that far off. So this is the formal definition of a vulnerability according to the CVE program, which is an organization that identifies and catalogs publicly disclosed cybersecurity vulnerabilities. The definition itself here is a little bit long, but there's a few key components that we can take away, which is specifically that a vulnerability is something that causes a weakness in your software, and it's a weakness that can be exploited. And this exploitation leads to some sort of negative impact. And that impact is something that can cause a loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability to your software. So that definition right there is sort of the crux between a vulnerability in your software and just a regular old bug. It's that this flaw is something that makes it possible for you to be exploited. So now that we've defined vulnerability, our next question might be, why do we care? Or maybe it's actually really intuitive that we don't want vulnerabilities in our dependencies. So another question you might have is, why do we seem to care so much right now? So since I was last at GopherCon EU, one of the things that you might have heard a lot more about is this idea of software supply chain attacks and this need to secure our software supply chain. And that's because there have been a lot of high-profile attacks in the news. Some, or maybe all of these, you might recognize. There's also a lot of research and statistics that have been published to back up the fact that this rise in supply chain attacks is really real. For example, according to one source, there have been more than 12,000 attacks between 2020 and 2021, and that represents over a 650% year-over-year increase. And lastly, we care a lot about vulnerabilities in our supply chain because, well, at least in the US, the president told us to. In 2021, there was this executive order that was issued to improve the nation's cybersecurity. And it specifically called out enhancing software supply chain as being vital to the federal government's ability to perform its critical functions. So this might now make you sort of want to ask, what is a software supply chain? Some of you might already be familiar with this concept, but just to illustrate the importance of this for our talk, I'm going to start by discussing what a supply chain attack is and what it looks like in general with something that I really like to do and a hobby that I kind of got into over the pandemic, which is baking. So let's say you want to bake a cake. Well, for anyone who's baked before, you know that in order to do that, we need a bunch of different things. Of course, you need ingredients. You need your flour, milk, eggs, and all of those things. But you also need equipment, like a bowl to put the stuff into, an oven, and all the stuff that you need to serve the cake on. And when you take all your ingredients and you take all your supplies and you combine it into this series of steps, you will produce a cake that's hopefully really good and people will eat it, maybe even ourselves. And we can kind of think of all of the components that lead to this cake being produced as our cake supply chain. So this supply chain basically is every single thing that you need and every single step that you take as the supplier of the cake in order to create some finished product that you get to an end consumer. And this includes gathering your ingredients to making sure your bowl is clean and the oven is on right and all of that. And of course, we can go even further out. Where did this chocolate come from? Did we get it from Germany or Switzerland? But for the purposes of this analogy, we'll just stick to the things on this diagram. Now, let's say I have an allergy. For example, maybe I'm allergic to gluten. So I want to bake a gluten-free cake. And in order to do that, I'm going to need to make sure that at every single step of my cake supply chain, things are gluten-free. So this means not just that checking all my ingredients are gluten-free, but also that my bowls and my cake pans and all the stuff that I have also been cleaned. This might seem really intuitive to you. You, as the baker and the supplier of the cake, of course you want to make sure that there's nothing in it that could harm the end consumer, especially if they might have a really severe gluten intolerance like celiac disease. And to do that, the only way that we can do that is to make sure that we're actually checking for gluten at every step of the supply chain, and we can protect the cake from the substance that the consumer is vulnerable to. As the supplier of the cake, we can make sure that that's the case by checking at every single step. So we can apply the same concepts to software, and the software that we want to ship to an end user. So in the same way, when you're building a piece of software, your software supply chain is not just the code that you write. It is your source code, but it's also all the tools that you use for your build processes, the dependencies you pull in, your deployment pipeline, the artifacts that you build, all the way until you have a piece of software that's delivered to an end user and executed. And we all know when we're baking a cake to check for and not include things that we don't actually want to be in the cake and things that the consumer is vulnerable to. But what about when it comes to our software? How can we be sure that we're not shipping vulnerabilities to our end user because of something we didn't check for in our own software supply chain? And as the end consumer, how do we know that this code that we're downloading, and we are taking it from a complete stranger off the internet, is actually safe to run? Well, the short answer is that we should check at every single step in the same way that we'd be baking a gluten-free cake. And we want to make sure that our software supply chain is protected at every step of the way. So today, we're going to talk about a specific piece of our supply chain, which is finding vulnerabilities in our dependencies. After all, we all use open source software. We're all going to continue to do so, and there's a lot of benefits to doing that. But when we are downloading this code from someone that we've never met before and know nothing about, there are a lot of benefits to making sure that we're not putting ourselves at risk and becoming the next one of these headlines. So how do we do this? Well, conceptually, a really straightforward way to do this would be to just check for all the dependencies in your project against some sort of database of vulnerabilities. And we can do that by taking our go.mod file, parsing out our dependencies, and then comparing to some sort of database of vulnerabilities. If you've been developing in Go for a little while, you're probably already familiar with the concept of Go modules and the go.mod file. But if not, a module is simply just a collection of Go packages stored together in a file tree and versioned together with a go.mod file at its root. If you've never seen a go.mod file before, this is what it looks like if we zoom in on one. And for any given module, it will specify the module path, the Go version, your direct dependencies, and your transitive dependencies. And conceptually, if we take this file, parse out our dependencies that are listed, check them against some sort of database, we can figure out which ones are vulnerable. And the great thing is you actually don't have to build any of this stuff yourself. There are a ton of free security tools out there that will just do this check for you. A common one you're probably already familiar with is Dependabot. So what Dependabot will do is it will actually scan your GitHub code base for vulnerabilities. But there are tons of other free scanners in the market that will also scan your go.mod file. I'm just using Dependabot as an example because I assume that a lot of us out here in the audience use GitHub, and we might use it for hosting source code and be already familiar with this tool. So every once in a while, I'll get some sort of email in my inbox that looks like this, and it'll tell me that there are known security vulnerabilities that have been found in my project. And at the bottom of this email, there's this button. It says, review all your vulnerable dependencies. And when I click on this button, it'll take me to a page like this, which is really, really helpful because I now don't have to go and do the work of finding some vulnerability database and writing all the code and comparing my own go.mod file against it myself. So GitHub has done a lot of really amazing work to sort of help us reason about the developer experience and our dependencies. And like I mentioned, there are many other scanners out there that also kind of do the same sort of thing. There are a few things, though, that we as the Go security team wanted to build on, specifically to make this workflow better for Go developers. So if we go back to my go.mod file, you can see that I only have 3 direct dependencies in this project. And these are probably the only 3 libraries that I'm actually familiar with and interact with on a regular basis. But this page here, it tells me that I have 15 vulnerabilities that affect me. And I'm not even really familiar with some of the modules that are listed here. For example, I've never seen this XML package before. And this page says that it is a critical vulnerability. So that sounds pretty scary. The one beneath it is this XNet HTML package. And again, I'm not really sure how this is being pulled into my code. And now that I know that I have 15 vulnerabilities in my dependencies, I have to go and investigate them and resolve them. Sometimes these are going to be relevant, sometimes they're just not. And of course, I can always just blindly update, run go get-u, and decide that's sufficient and move on. But it's also very possible that breaking changes could have occurred in the fixed version, and that might cause some other issues in my code, and then I have to go and fix that. And having to go and deal with 15 different vulnerabilities when all I really want to do is sit down and write my code is pretty frustrating. I don't even really know how some of these are being pulled into my code base in the first place, and the only thing that I personally really care about is getting my feature shipped. So on the Go team, we've been asking ourselves, how can we use and build on the work that other people have done? And how can we use this to make a process that's better for Go developers? So there are 3 main goals that we had as we were thinking about how to build out Go support for vulnerability management. The first is that we wanted to have a comprehensive and high-quality data source for vulnerabilities, so that when you're reading a vulnerability report, you can make sure that all the information is accurate and you have the context that you actually need to make a decision about what to do with that vulnerability. The second is that we want our alerts to be low noise. We don't want to have to tell you to go and fix 15 vulnerabilities if none of them actually matter to you. And lastly, we want this information to be widely available. We want to bring vulnerability data to the tools that you are already using so that you don't have to go out there and figure out how to match it against your projects yourself. So our first goal is to create this database of comprehensive and high-quality information. And to do that, we pull vulnerability data in for a bunch of different sources. This includes third-party sources like GHSAs from the GitHub Security Advisories database and CVEs from the National Vulnerability Database. It also includes vulnerabilities in the Go project. So if you subscribe to Golang Announce, you'll occasionally receive these emails that we've released security fixes for the standard library, and these are also part of the vulnerability database. And lastly, it includes direct contributions from Go package maintainers like all of you. So if you maintain a Go project and you know about vulnerabilities in your own project, please feel free to use this form to contribute and disclose all of your publicly disclosed vulnerabilities that you would like to see added to this database and for others in the ecosystem to know about. So we take the vulnerabilities from all of these sources, and then we aggregate them into this centralized source that we call the Go vulnerability database. And I mentioned that in addition to wanting our data source to be comprehensive, we also want it to be high quality. And so to do that, what happens is that before a report goes into the database, someone on the Go security team actually reviews and curates this information. That way, we can be sure to maintain a consistent quality and style. And we also want to add more granular information, such as data about which vulnerable functions are actually being called inside that package. We take these reports and format them according to the OSV format, and then they are all publicly accessible via vuln.go.dev. Our second goal is to make sure that we're producing low noise alerts so that you're spending your time addressing vulnerabilities that actually affect you. I mentioned earlier that a simple way to do this would be to simply take the vulnerabilities in your go.mod file and then compare every dependency with some sort of database of vulnerabilities. So doing this is, of course, one strategy, but it can lead to a lot of false positives. Just because something is in your module graph, it doesn't mean it's actually in your execution path. So going back to this sample go.mod file I have, you might look at it and be like, well, there's only 3 direct dependencies. I can see all the transit dependencies on this page. How much work would it really be to resolve all of them? And your mental model might be something like this is what your module graph looks like, and how much work could it possibly really be? But this go.mod file was for a personal project that I made, and it probably spent no more than a weekend on this whole project. If you look at a bigger project like Kubernetes, for example, this is what your go.mod file actually looks like. And in that case, investigating vulnerabilities and potentially all of these dependencies can take you a pretty long time. So thankfully in Go, we believe that we can use static analysis to help you save your time. And as I alluded to earlier, just because a module is in your module graph does not mean that it necessarily imports a package that is in that module, or that you're even calling an affected function in one of those packages. So what do I mean by this? Well, let's say we have 3 modules, modules A, B, and C. And module A at version A requires module B at version 1 and module C at version 1. And the reason is because you have a package inside module A that imports a package inside module B that imports package C inside module C. And this is because function A is inside package A, it calls function B inside package B, which calls function C inside package C. So what happens if function C contains a vulnerability? Well, we would then say that package C is vulnerable, module C is vulnerable, so our functions B, package B, and module B, all the way up to function A, package A, and module A. But what if function A instead called a different function inside module B? What if function A instead called function D inside package D? And that function is not vulnerable. Well, in that case, even though modules C and B still contain a vulnerability, it doesn't actually affect module A at all. And if you're only working on module A, and that's the one that you care about, you probably don't want to be alerted of vulnerabilities inside modules B and C, since they're not actually part of your execution path. And if you are looking only at your go.mod file, you can result in false positive alerts like that. But we can use static analysis to detect for vulnerable functions in your code and produce no-noise vulnerability alerts. And even though anyone could theoretically just read the data from the Go vulnerability database themselves, we wanted to make it really, really easy for Go developers to scan for vulnerabilities in their projects. We do this by making Go support for vulnerability management widely available through all of the existing tools that you might already be using as a Go developer. So here are a few places that you can find vulnerability information in your existing workflows. Let's start with the CLI tool, GopherCon. So GopherCon applies the concept that we just discussed to surface vulnerable functions in your code. GopherCon is a command line tool, and you can run it on your command line to scan for your code and find vulnerabilities in your dependencies. It uses static analysis to try and capture which vulnerable functions are actually being called. And we believe that by having the tool do this, we can narrow down the number of alerts that you actually need to spend time dealing with so that you can all get back to building the things that you want to be doing faster. So remember earlier, I had this chart, and I said that module-level analysis led us to find 15 vulnerabilities in our code. Well, here's what happens when we run GopherCon. It tells us that our code is only affected by 2 different vulnerabilities. And this suddenly makes the problem seem a lot more tractable. 2 is a lot closer to 0 than 15. And this can mean the difference between having to work late on a Friday to make sure we don't slip a release. For each of these 2 vulnerabilities, the output of GopherCon will tell us the following. It gives us a short description of the vulnerability, a link to package site with more information, the versions where the vulnerability is found and fixed, and a call stack. So this call stack will actually point you to the exact line of code in your project where the vulnerability occurs. And that way, when you have a vulnerability that transitively affects your code, you don't have to sort through all the code yourself to figure out how did this even end up affecting me. The bottom half of the Go vuln check output will highlight that the section is purely informational. And what it tells us is the packages in our project that are vulnerable that we import, but we don't call any vulnerable functions. It also lets you know that you don't need to take any action here. And we only include this information in the output because we've heard from our user studies that developers want this information and they'd like to know which vulnerable packages they're importing. So going back to this chart of vulnerabilities from earlier, hopefully, Go vuln check has now just saved you a lot of work. We now know that only 2 of them actually really matter to us, and that those are the ones that we have to resolve. We have a call stack of exactly which lines of code result in the vulnerability being executed, and we also have information to deal with that accordingly. So we expect that users will want to run Go vuln check not only on their terminal, but also their CI/CD pipelines, and that's something that we're looking to invest in next. As a starting point, we just published a GitHub action for Go vuln check on the GitHub Marketplace. So we hope that for developers who do use GitHub Actions, this will make it a lot easier for you to be able to integrate Go vuln check directly into your existing CI systems. Another place we like to surface vulnerability data is the Go package discovery site, pkg.go.dev, because we know that this is where developers go to find and evaluate Go packages that they want to pull in. So say you're on pkg.go.dev, and you're searching for some package you might want to pull into your project. If that package has a vulnerability, a red badge will show up next to the package name on the search page. If instead you were looking straight at the package documentation, you'll see this red banner at the top of the page, and it will alert you of the vulnerability and provide you with a short description of what it is. And if you're not using the latest version of that package, you can click on the versions page to see other versions that may or may not be affected. The Go package discovery site also has these detailed descriptions for every report that's in the Go vulnerability database so that you don't have to just read the raw JSON. This makes it easier, hopefully, for all of you to browse and read about the vulnerabilities that affect you. And these are the pages that are linked to from the Go vuln check output. Lastly, you can actually run vulnerability scanning directly from your editor using the Go extension for Visual Studio Code. So to scan for vulnerabilities in your module, you just run the toggle vuln check command. VS Code Go will then query the Go vulnerability database and match information from that database with the actual dependencies in your project. So from your go.mod file, you can see diagnostics for potential vulnerable dependencies. You can also take a code action to run Go vuln check and see which vulnerable functions are actually being called. And by hovering over a given dependency, you can view information about the vulnerabilities that affect it. From your terminal, you can run Go vuln check to see all the places in your code where vulnerable functions are being executed. And lastly, you can upgrade a version of your dependency where the vulnerability is fixed just by clicking on this quick fix option. So that's where we're currently at with the project for Go support for vulnerability management. We hope that you will try it out and give us feedback. And you can install it just by running Go vuln check on your terminal using this command on the screen. Eventually, we hope that vulnerability detection will be a part of the main Go toolchain. And we would love to hear from all of you about how this existing functionality is currently working for you today so that we can work on building out what is best for the Go community. And thank you, everyone. And to learn more about vulnerability management for Go and what the Go security team is up to, you can visit go.dev/security. I'll also be here for the rest of the conference, so please don't hesitate to come up and chat with me if you have any questions about any of this. And thank you all for joining me for this talk.